Last week, Pastor Cynthia preached on being a neighbor and how we know who our neighbor is. This week, I am moving on to the next step, that of community. Now, when we hear the word community, the immediate image that comes to mind, or the concept that we think of, is, to most of us, that of a group of people with something in common, like a church congregation. The people living on our street, sports team fans gathered together to watch a game. These are a few examples. However, when you look up the definition in the dictionary, what you see is exactly that. That is the first definition of community. But there are several things to point out about the common understanding of community. One, members of a community do not necessarily know one another. Two, even if they know one another, they don't necessarily like one another. And there is no requirement that they share common goals or values to be defined as a community. And to make my point, I would just point out that technically, Congress is a community. So that gives you something to think about. We talk about community a lot without really understanding the complexity of what a community can be and what it is. And there's another word, communitas. It's a Latin word that is the root word of community, and now is used commonly to describe what we sort of think of as community. And the definition is referring to either an unstructured community in which people are equal, or the very spirit of community. And that I grabbed off of Wikipedia. If we go a little bit further and deeper into the definition, we find the very spirit of community, an intense community spirit, the feeling of great social equality, solidarity, and togetherness. Now that's nice. I like the sound of that. That's when I think most of the time when we talk about being in a community, that's what we are thinking of. We're thinking of a togetherness, a unity, a focus that is shared. Now, the experience of communitas can be very long-lasting and durable for a particular group, or it can be spontaneous and very transient. Author Diana Butler Bass, in her book Grounded, which is the inspiration for this fall's worship series, describes an experience at a baseball game when the Washington Nationals played a truly exceptional game and won. And on a, bases loaded, 2 outs, fly ball, caught, the crowd went wild. A spontaneous moment of joy when all of the fans, the Washington fans, were aligned and focused and cheering on their team. But it was also something that shortly dissipated. Now, moving into the realm of Christianity, we find numerous moments in the scriptures, and interestingly enough, I would not include Pentecost, when the disciples were speaking in such a way that all could understand them in their own language. And the reason I would not include Pentecost as one of the scriptural experiences of communitas is we read that many people were confused, they were perplexed, others were mocking the disciples, saying they were full of new wine. And I'm not sure why new wine is any more intoxicating than aged vintage wine. Personally, I'll go for the vintage. Now, this does not sound like a unified community to me. Now, events I find possible where communitas spontaneously arose would include events like the feeding of the 5,000, when you had a large group come together and we assume shared, given they had just a few loaves of bread and a few fish and collected, what was it, a dozen baskets of leftovers afterwards. Again, and maybe on the Sermon on the Mount, as people were spellbound by the preaching of Jesus. Again, coming together, focused, sharing, being of one mind and one focus. Now, throughout the ages, religious communities have strived to create a sense of unity among their followers. And certainly the early church and the first preachers emphasized the need and desire for solidarity, for, we'll say, they would have said community, I'll say communitas, but for that focus on each other, on their community, on being together, on sharing, on the words of Christ, there was a commonality that they were seeking to build up. And the call to care for each other as well as to care for the outsider. And of course, in the religious community, we have communion, a ritual designed to share community experience, to create unity, to offer the gift of fellowship and shared sanctity, bringing us in to that spirit of being together, of being focused, of oneness. Think today of all the work and effort that we all put into creating not only a community, but creating communitas. The thought and effort and creativity that we put in just showing up for worship on Sunday morning. The creativity and the energy that goes into all the committees that we sit on, that we bring together, thinking about and working towards what are the experiences we can create that help people focus on God, on the community, focus on Christ, focus on the message, focus on doing God's work in the world. Whether it's the deacons on the worship life, whether it's the trustees on making sure we have a physical facility that is not distracting. Hence, air conditioning helps make it less distracting in the summer. But all of this work that goes in, all doing work that draws people into the spirit and the activity of our community, and the rewards that we get, what do we take out of it? The sense of belonging in a world that is too often alienating. Knowing that we are with and together with others seeking to not only find meaning, but to express the meaning in ways that support and build the fellowship and provide service in the world. And speaking of the world, one of those services and offerings is taking what we have learned here and taking it out into our greater community. The question I propose to answer is, how do we become builders of communitas in the many fractured communities of which each of us is a member? And I assure you, it is not always easy. One of the enduring myths within our country in particular is the belief that our small communities around the country are very intimate, close communities, sharing their hardships, sharing their joys, sharing their energies. But this is not always the case. For instance, the writer Monica Potts, in an op-ed piece in the New York Times 2 weeks ago, wrote about returning to her hometown of Clinton, Arkansas. Population, I believe, is around 2,500. And in part she writes, "Since coming back, I've realized that it is true that people here think life has taken a turn for the worse. What's also true, though, is that many here seem determined to get rid of the last institutions that can help them, to keep people of education out, and to retreat from community life and concentrate on taking care of themselves and their own families. It's an attitude that is against taxes, immigrants, and government, but also against helping your neighbor. When I read this, I was truly frightened. And to me, this is very scary, that people are actively retreating from the communities to which they belong, and they are willing to contribute very little to and sacrifice less to build a sense of community. And how well we know that the too often fractured nature of the many communities in which we willingly or unwillingly are part of. And this is where our faith and what we've learned here come in. Because the very first part of breaking into that fracturedness is taking our spirit, taking the lessons of acceptance who you are now in the place that you are, not in who I want you to be, not in who you could be, but accepting today that you may be one that is alienated from me, one that does not even like me, one that does not believe the same way that I do. Yet we are called to accept as the first step in going from fractured to together. And the second step is not so much different. And remembering that we are called to love others as we love ourselves is a really good place to start. The second piece is listening. It is somewhat difficult to do this sometimes with people that disagree with us, that have different values, that are willing to denigrate us. Now, I've been reading papers a lot lately. I found a really interesting article in last week's Wall Street Journal by Peter Boghausen and James Lindsay entitled, "Social Justice Warriors Won't Listen, But You Should." They make two main points. The first is that serious believers, and not just social justice warriors, will not talk with you. They will only talk at you. And they will dismiss any argument that you make as specious. Their solution, the author's solution for these encounters, is not to argue, because that benefits no one and gets nowhere. Their solution is to listen. They maintain that what you can get from the conversation is an understanding of the person and their views. You will at least gain some understanding of the persons and their beliefs. You are not called to believe them, to accept them, but you will understand. If you are curious, if you ask questions, you will understand their sincerity. The other benefit of listening and learning to both those you agree with and those you don't is, as I said earlier, going back to learning and practicing acceptance, one of the hallmarks of Christian life. This is one of the first steps towards building community and communitas within and without the life of the church. Consciously working towards acceptance and understanding also brings us closer to not only creating community and communitas, but also bringing us to becoming God's presence in the world. We know that God is with us. God is here now. But God is speaking and listening and accepting through us. Those who are community builders are God's presence in the world. May it be so.